Good morning, afternoon and evening, everybody, and welcome to today's launch for our brand new report, The Future of Business Continuity and Resilience. It's a real pleasure to be launching this report in partnership with ResCube, who've been great support throughout the project. It's the second report that we've produced. We have produced another report on the same subject last year, and it's really interesting to see just how much the industry has moved on in the past year. My name is Rachel Elliott. I'm Head of Thought Leadership at the BCI, and it's my responsibility and the team's responsibility to put the report together. So it is now available to download on the BCI website. So if you haven't got a copy of that report already, if you go to our website, go over to Knowledge Base if you don't see it immediately on the front page, and you'll be able to download that report. There will be a few times in the presentation where I'll reference a page number in that report, so it's quite useful to have it to hand if I haven't already. Now, I already said that ResCube were the sponsors of this report, and it's a real pleasure today to have Andrew Lawton, who is the founder and CEO of ResCube, on today's webinar. So welcome, Andrew, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Rachel. Just a quick intro. If any of you have had a chance to quickly Google who ResCube are, you'll have seen that ResCube was born from Fortress AS, which is a work area recovery company in London, focusing on supporting financial services and law firms in the city. We sponsored this report as Fortress AS last year, and I actually started Fortress back in 2016, and for a while all was going well. We were winning awards and winning customers, but of course the pandemic hit, and here we all are working from home. And over the past 18 months we've proven that we can be highly productive at home. So as we'll look in more detail a little bit later on, organisations decided that they'd use home working as a fallback generally for their offices and not use work area recovery. So the world changed. And so to remain relevant and to continue delivering value, we had to think fast and move fast. And one thing that sort of struck me when people ask about work area recovery services, they're always asking how resilient the recovery centres are. Of course, they don't want to have a disaster in their main office, bring all their people to the recovery centre and have a second disaster there. But it's actually quite easy to build resilience into a building with dual feed power and dual feed comms, UPS and generator, etc. But of course, all of the critical work that was happening in the recovery centre is now happening in the home. And so building resilience into homes is actually not quite as simple. It's actually complex and messy business. If you're an enterprise, there are obviously a lot more of them, and there are generally no technical resources on site. So you can send a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply, a 4G failover router, a lot of cables to all of your critical staff homes. But most of those staff are probably not going to be technical, and you're basically causing yourself a bit of a support nightmare. And you'll end up with homes that probably aren't actually as resilient as you'd hope they were. So, and that's particularly true if you're a large enterprise and those numbers run into hundreds or possibly even thousands. So, long story short, we developed ResCube, which provides always-on power and comms for critical home workers. And it's all in one enterprise-grade box. It's very simple to deploy globally. It's very easy to set up in the home by the employee, and it's managed centrally via dashboards and connect into your existing network management tools. So very simple for your network management team or your IT team to run that. Or in fact, IT services providers. So we work with some of the world's largest on that. So as ResCube's still highly relevant to the content of the report, we're very pleased to be sponsoring it and supporting the BCI this year too. I'm very eager to share the findings this morning.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. And I should just remind everyone who's listening today that the BCI research is impartial. It's carried out completely by the BCI, and Rescue don't have any input on those answers that we get, because there are some quite positive stories later on about work area recovery and what people are doing. So just to reinforce that to listeners, the research is completely impartial, and the BCI sort of take control of that. It won't just be me talking today. As you've already met Andrew, there are also 2 other people who will be on the panel at the end of the call. Chris Miller and Terry Downing. They're going to be inputting little bits throughout the presentation as well. They're both very, very knowledgeable people about the subjects that have come up in this report. I've very, very much enjoyed talking to them over the past few weeks about various subjects that have come up. And they've got some really, really fascinating knowledge to share. Chris, you're nearest on my screen. Can you just give a couple of sentences intro about yourself and what you do? Just a couple of sentences, that would be great.
Oh, thanks, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Well, I'm at Vincentia, 3 hours south of Sydney, so Andrew's comments about remote working are very well placed. I've been a business continuity manager for 16 years as of next month, and before that I worked on all sorts of emergencies, including a whole lot of health emergencies, which have become incredibly relevant in the current pandemic. So starting back in AIDS, HIV in the mid-80s, through SARS-1, MERS, swine flu, and now COVID. So there have been many challenges that my clients and colleagues and I have worked together on. So I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Terry.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Terry Downing. I'm the resilience manager and the head of our operational resilience for Legal and General Group Technology. Welcome to my back cave at home here, my man cave. I've been remote working for nearly 2 years since COVID started. I've been in business continuity and resilience. Well, this is my 44th year, would you believe? Because I've been doing this for a long time. I may look young, but I've been doing it for quite a while. And I'm also a chartered information technology professional, and I look forward to the conversations later.
Thank you very much, Terry. And what we've got on this webinar today is 3 people who've got a lot of experience in the industry, years and years, as you heard from Terry there, 44 years. But the reason I've chosen these particular people for the webinar is they've got a lot of experience, but they're also very, very forward-thinking people and have got a lot of really good ideas about where our industry is going to. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say later on. Just a quick reminder, there's a questions panel on the right-hand side on your GoToWebinar sort of panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask as we're going along, please just put them in there, and we'll do our very, very best to answer them at the end. But it would be good if you could just keep them going in, and you'll be able to look at it. I've just had a note in on the questions actually from Carolyn Murphy. She said maintenance is being performed on your website, so I can't download. I don't think I'll be able to just put that in chat just yet, Carolyn. It doesn't matter if you don't have the report for this. You will get all the findings presented to you. But I know the website is about to go up again. It was unfortunately scheduled maintenance. So that will go up, and I'll make sure everyone knows when that happens. So just a quick overview of the demographics of this report. We got 456 respondents, good response rate, and very, very global response as well. So 64 countries are featured in this, and it was a really good split across all geographies. And actually, most geographies mirrored what others were saying. So there weren't too many regional discrepancies, which was really, really good to see. And with that response base and that diversity of base, I really think the answers we've got in this survey are very, very credible. We had a broad spread of functional roles as well answering this. So 51% were business continuity practitioners, we had high proportions as well from risk management, crisis management, and health and safety. 5% as well from board level, always encouraging to see that people at the very, very top are interested in the subjects. And we'll talk a lot more about how the board are interacting with business continuity and how important resilience is to them. We had 10% in the other category, and I wouldn't normally mention this, but when you've got such a huge number, you think, what have I asked wrong in the survey? How could I have asked this demographic section better? Really, really interesting. So in that 10%, the vast majority said, I work in resilience. I'm head of resilience. I'm a resilience manager, resilience analyst. So it's interesting to see that the industry is already moving towards resilience, and people aren't just rebranding their job titles as resilience managers, as we saw quite a lot last year. They're actually got an expanded remit within their organisations to really look at resilience and ensure that the organisation is more resilient going forward. We also had 12 interviews with some of the people who'd responded to the survey. These are people who'd answered some very interesting comments in the survey, and I had about an hour's conversation with 12 people, and we really got to the bottom of some really, really interesting topics which are featured in this survey, and that helps to bring a bit more colour into the report, and also it helps to provide some general qualitative background to the figures that you see in this report. Broad sector mix as well. Often we get financial services dominating. That's sort of starting to wane a bit. It is our number one category, but we got a lot from professional services, government and administration, IT, and healthcare. So really, really broad response rate, and really encouraging to see that we got so many respondents, particularly when we've got a lot of reports on the go at the moment. So the first section looks at resilience and organisational structure. This looks at how resilience and business continuity are viewed from within the organisations, and sort of what is top of mind for business continuity professionals as resilience goes. The first question we asked in the survey was, we wanted to understand just how strategic the role is now of business continuity professionals. And what we can see there is a real step change between before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So we asked respondents to rate on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 was purely operational and 100 was purely strategic, where the business continuity manager now sat within that range. So you can see before the pandemic, it was verging on the operational. It was more operational than strategic, as you'd expect. Business continuity managers are, by definition, involved in the operational response in incidents and don't necessarily have so much strategic input. Now, when that is looked at from after the pandemic perspective, we can see now that that's tipped the balance to 58.8. So it's actually gone more on the strategic side. Really interesting for the first question, I think you all agree. So a substantial increase in the view that business continuity and resilience has become a major contributor to the strategic direction of the business. Now, there's a few reasons for that, some which will come to light later on in the report. But you know, the spotlight has really been put on business continuity and resilience during the pandemic. They've become much more visible in organisations, and senior management are really using them for guidance. Often that didn't happen right at the beginning of the pandemic. I think there was also panic in organisations, and actually a lot of business continuity departments were ignored right at the beginning, and management sort of made their own plans without consulting them. That's all settled down now, and BC and resilience has got that attention they deserve, and they're being very, very well respected for it. Business continuity and resilience professionals, they have a really, really good view of the business. They have a good overview of how all the departments function. Day to day, they're dealing with a lot of departments in the business. So they've got a really good overview, an unrivaled view, I'd say, of the business. And that's something which management are really, really regarding now. And they can also advise. So we've seen a lot of companies have to change direction during the pandemic. And business continuity are now being brought in by management to really advise if a new strategic direction will work from a business continuity perspective. A lot of professionals who answered this survey said that they were now much, much closer to senior management following the pandemic than they ever have been before. Now, I'd like to bring Chris back, if that's okay. I know she's got some thoughts that she'd like to share on this particular subject area and the strategic role of business continuity within organisations.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. And one of the things that I've been observing is the need to sort of push up from the detailed operational BIAs to a more strategic, or at least a tactical BIA. And that focuses the mind and feeds into that value for the C-suite. So is that whole way in which we present the data. So we still need the detail that we had in the operational space for the recovery plans, but we're presenting the data in a different way, rolled up to a higher level, so that it seems to add value to the C-suite. I suppose I do have the advantage of generally being engaged by someone with chief in their name, but nonetheless, I'm encouraging more junior business continuity managers to position themselves away from that operational tradesperson space into a valued advisor space, and trying to get more leverage in that space.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Useful insights there. Now, the next question, this also looks at how management are engaging, also looks at how staff are engaging as well. So this is a percentage of management and staff who are very or somewhat aware of the role of business continuity and resilience within their organisations. If we look at management first, you can see there more understand resilience than business continuity. You'd expect that because they are sort of more involved in strategic issues generally. With staff, on the other hand, they're resonate much more with business continuity than they do with resilience. I think that's because they see business continuity around the business, tend to be slightly more operational than the board, so that's why we're seeing that discrepancy. But what we can see is there's a real divide here between the understanding of management and staff, much lower understanding. And I think that points to the fact that we really do need to continue that training and exercising within organisations. I can see you've already had a question coming about training and exercising from Sandeep, so we'll try and get onto that later. But there's a real gap between knowledge of staff and management. And I think, you know, we do need to keep that training and exercising going. We need to keep those education programs in businesses really promoting what business continuity does, and resilient, and the importance of having a resilience organisation, the part every person in that organisation has to play in making that organisation resilient. So I thought that was an interesting slide, and you know, really enforces the fact that we can't just sit back and expect people to know what we do. We really have to keep promoting it. Now, the big word that's been discussed so much during this pandemic is remote working, and we're seeing that in varying degrees across countries, across sectors. Some countries are now fully back in their offices, others are very much more still working in a remote environment. Many people have not returned to their offices since March last year. Now, what this slide tells us is the majority of staff would rather work entirely remotely, or at least partially remotely. And this ties in with other surveys that we've done. I'm based in the UK, and I saw a study done very, very recently where 70% of office workers believed they'd never return to the office at the same rate as they were before. A lot are currently trialling hybrid, in the office a couple of days a week. We have yet to see if that will be effective. Be interesting to see in a year's time just how this has developed. Now, I think a lot of organisations have traditionally seen working from home, you know, it does save costs. They may not have to use their work area recovery provider, for example, when they can just use work from home as a backup. But there are very definite implications for business continuity and resilience, which I'm going to discuss a bit more on the next slide. But that's already been highlighted, I think, in Andrew's introduction as well. There are going to be IT resilience challenges. You know, the initial shift to home working worked very, very effectively from a hardware perspective. Many people I spoke to were very, very complimentary of their IT departments in how well they manage that. But now we've got to look much more at infrastructure, cybersecurity, and you know, really making sure those home workers are protected just as they are in the office. Infrastructure challenges as well. Health and safety, again, we're going to discuss that more later, and also power and communications. These are all areas which, if staff are working from home, will have to be looked at if they haven't been already. And I think maybe those cost savings aren't quite as much as organisations may have initially thought. Now, I've already alluded to Andrew when I've been talking about this, but I think, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind coming back on and sharing just a few more words about this subject area.
Yeah, well, as you say, there have been a number of studies. I think Ernst & Young did a survey earlier on in the year that showed figures like 90% of staff were demanding flexible working, and over 50% said that they'd actually move jobs if flexible working wasn't available to them. And as a result, we're seeing a pretty consistent 40% reduction in the office footprint of our enterprise customers as people, organisations are trying to take advantage of home working. And of course, the office is changing as a place of work. It's no longer a place you go to do work. You tend to, or at least now and in the future, will be going to meet colleagues and collaborate. I think, you know, it's clear that although we're very productive at home, I think the creative side and communication side is still very much better done face to face. And so the offices are being restructured and set up for activity-based working. And now the real work actually happens back in the home office.
Thank you very much for that input, Andrew. Now we're going to look now at this actual question. Are the same standards of resilience, so that's, you know, for example, power and communications, being applied to home workers as they are in an office? Now, I've just highlighted what I perceive to be the main point on this slide. Only 46.3% of home workers benefit from the same levels of resilience at home as in the office. So there's a real gap here. So if people are performing critical activities within a remote environment, do they have that backup in place? The answer is, at the moment, a lot of them don't. So this clearly is an area that we need to work on more. And as well, you can see that one on the right-hand side there, 11.1% said they had no plans at all to apply the same standards to home workers. Now, I think when we look at this as well, a lot of people assume when we talk about outages at home, it is just communications outages, it's internet outages, don't actually consider power. Now, I was presenting a webinar right at the beginning of the week, and I had a power outage just for 20 seconds, but it was enough to knock me out on that webinar. And, you know, ideally, you do need to consider that kind of scenario, and it's probably likely to be much more crucial than one of my webinars. That, you know, power outages really do happen, and they can cause a major effect. I'm sorry to bring you back so soon, Andrew. I know you've already talked about this a bit, but I think if you could just provide a little more detail from your perspective, because you obviously know this area inside out. Thank you.
Well, it's a particularly interesting slide for us, because it obviously shows the percentage of those that have looked at resilience and those that will. I'd be interested to know whether those that answered yes to home worker resilience, we're talking about generally resilient systems, resilient communications, or resilient power. It's often the resilient power side of things that it gets forgotten. And I'm also based in the UK, and here we believe that actually most of our power is pretty stable. In the southeast of the UK, it is, but elsewhere around the country, it's actually pretty unstable. And here we get about 80 major power cuts every single day across the country, and that affects thousands of homes and of course home workers every single day. And around the world, plenty of countries are struggling with delivering enough power. We're demanding more and more power. Certainly North America has its challenges, particularly as we have higher and higher demand for things like air conditioning and electric cars. An electric car takes, battery charges takes probably about 10 times the average home's worth of electricity, for example. So this isn't a problem that's going to go away. If you are a remote worker, you are doing something that's critical to the business. Payroll was mentioned just ahead of the webinar. Then you need to ensure that you can continue working. And so this sort of power issue does need to be addressed.
Yeah, a very good point about electric cars. I know last month in September in the UK, we saw more electric cars sold than in the whole of the year last year. So that's something I hadn't actually thought about. So yeah, with sort of emissions targets that countries have got to meet, there will be much more demand on electricity over the next 10 years. I'd also like to bring Terry on, if that's okay, because I know when we've talked before, you've had an example of power issues, communications issues with the Indian workforce. So would you mind just sharing that, Terry?
Sure. Right, Rachel, thank you. First of all, I'd say I've been working from home for 22 months, and I'm in a rural area, and I do have power outages. So even here in the UK, it's not that stable. But what I want to talk about is in my previous employer, I changed employment 3 months ago. We had a large Indian workforce, and India is not known for stable power. And what we did was we'd already given before the pandemic our critical workers, and there was quite a lot of them in the telecoms company, home generators, UPS, and 3G and 4G access, mobile access. That's all well and good for a short term, but as Andrew alluded earlier, being at home, it's not the same as having a resilient system. There's power issues. There are not only with that, it's fuel, because in a national emergency, fuel is diverted to critical national infrastructure and not people at home. So your generator with your 4-gallon can may only last you a couple of days. The other thing about in India that we discovered is that the national government, during a civil unrest or terrorism attack, turn off both the physical and the mobile networks. So we actually have to find other interesting ways of connecting as well, or actually just pull people back into the office, which you can't do during a pandemic. And that was in India.
No, thank you, Terry. Real food for thought there with those comments. Thank you. Now, we are now going to look at our home workers required to meet the same health and safety standards and guidance as they are in the office. Again, I've highlighted what I consider to be the most crucial line on this slide, and it shows a real failing here. So 19%, so 1 in 5 organisations have the same health and safety requirements for staff working remotely as they do in the office. A quarter of them, if you look just above that, so over a quarter, have no plans in place at all. So that's a real concern. I think a lot of organisations managed to sort of get away with it in 2020, 2021, but authorities have now updated guidelines which it's advisable to adhere to in most situations. Obviously, currently not legally binding in a lot of countries. Some countries it is, but there's a lot of new guidance being updated. So in the UK, for example, the UK Health and Safety Executive have updated guidance. ACAS, big employment union, they actually admitted to turning a blind eye to it during COVID, because they appreciated that a lot of organisations were really battling to save their business, save their bottom lines. But they are now cracking down on ensuring that organisations do have the same measures in place for staff who are working remotely. The International Labour Organization, they've got a big document which covers multiple, I think most jurisdictions, about home working and health and safety guidance. It's well worth just going over to their website and downloading that document and having a look through and seeing just what kind of guidance they're offering and sharing about what different countries are doing. Andrew, sorry to bring you back again so soon. I know you've got a few points to share as well about health and safety.
Yes, very briefly, we looked at this last year, and it was clearly a problem area. We actually did a survey across companies in the UK, and we found that a very significant chunk, I think it was 34% of staff, were working from beds and sofas. In the early part of the pandemic. Well, say early part, it was June time, so 3 months in, and clearly, junior personnel often will not have a home office, or access to the right sort of facilities, and many of them were working, sat on a bed for 8 hours a day, and clearly, I think that's storing up problems, physical problems in the workforce, which of course are critically underpin our businesses. So I think it is something that needs to, well, it absolutely is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Andrew. And Chris, I know when we were having a chat, you almost aghast at the lack of attention to health and safety in Australia. So can you just share some of your thoughts about that?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Way back when I was a work health and safety inspector in Queensland, I was the first woman and the first non-engineer. So there's the old joke, you can take the girl out of work health and safety, but you can't take work health and safety out of the girl. And it was interesting before COVID, when many of my clients and colleagues, they would require an assessment for work health and safety and security, both physical and cyber, before they would approve people to work remotely. But magically, when COVID comes along, all those constraints just suddenly disappear. But unfortunately, the potential for insurance claims has not. So coming back to Andrew's point about people working in very unsatisfactory and unergonomic workspaces, that will come back to haunt them with the claims. And of course, there's the cyber issue, and we've already seen quite a significant rise in cyber attacks. And if you're sharing, in Australia, there's been a lot of homeschooling. If you're sharing your dining table with the kids, what documents are they seeing? Whoops. So there are a whole string of concerns in this work health and safety, security of documents, security in cyber terms that we need to wrap our heads around, especially if this working remotely is to continue beyond the current pandemic.
That's, interesting thought there about the children. Kids have got access to cameras. Who knows what documents will appear on Instagram, Snapchat, whatever the kids are up to these days. Yeah, really interesting comments there. And I've actually seen a question come in. It's come in as a comment from David Maurice. And he's actually said in Australia, there has been an increase in slips and trip type work cover claims due to staff working from home. So, that is the symptom of not taking, proper priority of health and safety issues in the home environment. Now, the other issue as well, when we're talking about health and safety, I think we often hear about, we naturally divert to, those trips and slips that David just mentioned. But it's also mental health, and that is an issue which has really risen to the fore during the pandemic. And what we found with mental health, the problem of mental health was not considered at the start of the pandemic. A lot of staff were just sent home. Management were very, very stressed in trying to keep the business afloat, and they just assumed staff could work from home and they'd be fine. Now, as Andrew just said when I invited him to talk, a lot of those staff, particularly younger staff, do not have the facilities to be able to work from home effectively. They relish being in an office so they can learn from their peers, they can chat to their peers, and it started to become an issue. And at first it really wasn't appreciated. So at the BCI, we ran some research right at the beginning of the pandemic. So in March 2020, around 50% of organisations had considered mental health and wellbeing in their BC plans. By May, this was up to 80%. The problem became so severe, it was sometimes referred to as the second pandemic. Now we've got a big proportion there, 29.6%, who actually say business continuity is not considered at all as part of business continuity plans. Now, when I interrogated that further, I spoke to a number of people who'd answered that over the course of the project. Some of them said that mental health and wellbeing was something which should be considered outside the realm of BC. It was something which was normally dealt with by HR and didn't fall into the remit, even though their organisations did actually have very, very advanced plans and help available to staff who were suffering from mental health issues. I always think that shouldn't necessarily be the case, whilst it's okay for HR to get everything in place. Business continuity should be in communication with HR to ensure that those health and wellbeing plans are sufficient for business continuity purposes. Again, that goes into that sort of collaboration that we're seeing as organisations move towards resilience. It's very much about ensuring that those channels of communication are open with the relevant parties. I know Terry and Chris, you've both got some thoughts you'd like to share about this point. So Terry, I know Chris has just been on. If you wouldn't mind just giving a few quick thoughts about this.
Yeah, I'm a mental health first aider, and I've seen during COVID the impact on not only junior staff but senior members of staff, where the human animal is a social animal, and we need interaction with people. And this isolation and the only interacting with your people on Zoom has had an impact. But what we have to remember is that from a business continuity point of view, loss of people is actually one of the impact areas, and it's a key vector. And it's also listed by the financial regulators for the new regulations that loss of people and the productivity of people is affected, and people do get very ill. People have anxiety attacks and panic attacks, which stop them. And so we do, as business continuity people, have to consider the human factor and the mental health of individuals. I think we can't just dismiss it.
No, thank you very much, Terry. And Chris?
Yes, just to reinforce Terry's good point and your point too, Rachel, this data indicates to me that we're really only scratching the surface in terms of preparedness in this space with many businesses. I mean, although your first two responses add up to 50, more than half of that 50 is just starting to consider this issue in the pandemic. And I believe that the smarter businesses are preparing more fulsomely because they appreciate that the mental health issues are only just at the tip of the iceberg, and there's a tsunami to follow as the pandemic abates. And they could be critical staff for your business. So you do need to be getting on the front foot.
Yeah, good words of wisdom there, Chris. Thank you. Now moving on to the next section. So I've already talked about the importance of having management buy-in, if you like, into business continuity and also the overall resilience of the organisations. And what the pandemic has done, we've seen those levels of interest really elevate during the pandemic. BC and resilience has got that spotlight that they've always wanted, always desired. In some organisations, not in all, and we will be looking at that in a bit more detail in this section. So this is an interesting question. So what is your opinion of establishing a board level appointment who is responsible for promoting resilience at all levels and ensuring all resilience building efforts are aligned? Now the golden nugget here is having that chief resilience officer in place within an organisation. And when I've talked to people, that is now happening. It's no longer hearsay. We are seeing people being put at board level in this position in organisations. And there's been a real change. This is one of the most dramatic increases we've actually seen year on year. So this year, you can see nearly half of respondents say they've got someone in place, a further 8.4% saying they were appointed during the pandemic. In 2020, less than a third had such a role in their organisations. So you can see that there's been a real change in direction here for organisations, and they appreciate the importance of having someone who is responsible for resilience on the board. Sometimes the roles of senior management haven't changed, but new reporting lines have been created. So a business continuity manager may have had about 5 people to get through before they actually were heard on the board. But we're seeing reporting lines changing. Business continuity might report to the head of risk, who will then report into the board. So there's a lot less channels for business continuity to be forgotten about within those reporting lines. Some organisations, they haven't quite got to the stage of appointing a chief resilience officer, but they might have appointed a head of resilience who is just beneath board level, who has the interest very much at heart and will have that voice directly to the board. Another interviewee who I spoke to as part of this project, they said that they'd actually raised the subject with regional CEOs, and because of that, those regional CEOs were then reporting up to the central board, and the issue was being raised and was being dealt with very, very seriously. For those of you who have been able to download the report, make a note of this. If you haven't, page 28 of the report, there's some really, really good quotes around this subject area. Chris, you had quite an amusing comment about this when I spoke to you yesterday about CEOs just turning up now. So perhaps you'd like to just elaborate a bit more about that.
Yes, I've certainly noticed in the COVID environment, when I've been running what I call COVID plus exercises, but we'll come back to that, that the more senior people are turning up. So, for instance, I had an exercise where the CEO was in attendance, another one where the CEO, because it was a virtual thing, said he might drop by to observe. And that same exercise, even though I don't know whether the CEO did observe, but one of the deputies was there for the whole 3 hours and invested quite a lot of appreciation in the exercise, which was reflected in his debriefing comments, where he appreciated the workload that will be placed on his business continuity team, and in front of more than 30 witnesses offered to make more resources available to them, because it was plain to him that they would get stretched very thinly, very quickly. So there seems to be a real understanding, and this is with people with chief in their name.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I've just seen a comment come in from Sharon Buckland, actually, that's quite relevant to this, and she said the board rep has to be proactive in promoting and believing in resilience. There's no point having a rep that does little to help raise the profile of organisational preparedness. Very, very true, Sharon. I always say people have to have an interest in what they're doing in order to be able to promote that and really sell it to the organisation. So whilst this question does ask that, a board level appointment who is responsible for promoting resilience, they need to be able to do that. They don't need to have that as a responsibility. It needs to be ensured that promotion does happen. So thank you for that comment, Sharon. So what methods will you consider going forward? So that's a survey respondents, so you, to raise awareness of BC at board level. So what we learned during this crisis was frequently the board or senior management hadn't been involved in any part of learning about the BC life cycle. They hadn't been involved in the BIA process. So that meant there were a lot of differences arising between business continuity managers and senior management when, for example, a critical process had to be stopped. Management would say, we never agreed to that. Business continuity would probably say, well, yes, but you weren't involved in the BIA process. The management should be there. There needs to be a universal decision made as to what is critical for the business. So you can see there it's the top answer, only just So 50.4% ensure the board are involved in the BC life cycle. I think that's as low as it is because a lot of organisations are doing that. It's best practice. It's what the GPG, our good practice guidelines, talk about. You know, I think this also shows, you know, the other two that are near 50%. So that second point, ensuring regular training and exercising takes place. Now, this is across the organisation. Management are actually becoming really, really good at taking part in training and exercising now. As Chris just mentioned, they're becoming much more engaged in that process. So now's the time to really capitalise on that and ensure that that training and exercising does take place, not just for the board, for the whole organisation to really get that buy-in. And again, we've already talked about this, ensuring a direct reporting line is created to the board or the executive team. Now, I think both these points, the post-incident review is the golden opportunity to mention this and ensure these practices are considered and implemented, if possible, within the organisation. We're going to talk a bit more about the post-incident review in a minute, because the actual post-incident review may become much too late to be able to consider these. So it's something to raise in interim reviews as they come up. I think another point that's relevant here as well is that enroll BC champions across the business. I spoke to a lot of multinational organisations when we were doing this report, and some of them have got thousands of BC and or resilience champions within their organisation. They certainly didn't have it in their job title, but they were people who understood the importance of resilience. They understood the importance that business continuity had to play within organisations, and they were promoted in their particular area. And that's produced really good examples of good resilience in organisations. Also, the use of BCI events, I would promote this, but I think they're really, really good for promoting awareness. So BC Awareness Week, Business Continuity Awareness Week, that we run in May, that's where organisations can download materials, take part in promotional activities for BC and resilience across their organisations. And I've seen really big organisations take this to heart and use this week for really selling it into the organisation. There's also Education Month, which has just finished, where there's a lot of webinars available where people can listen to those and promote those in their organisations as well. And all those webinars are still on the BCI website as well, so you can look at those webinars and see what you can promote to your staff. Chris, I've noted here that you'd like to make a couple of points here. You talked a lot about COVID plus when I talked to you yesterday. If you perhaps enlighten us a bit more. Sounds interesting.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, COVID plus, as I call it. And that's encouraging businesses and colleagues to forget about pre-COVID. That's gone. That's nostalgia. You're in the new normal. You need to be planning for the next normal, but you need to be capturing those lessons and reviewing your plans with the lens of COVID. Because if you look particularly at larger organisations' business continuity planning documents, most of them were written without the COVID lens. And so some of the responses, the various activities that they had in mind that they would do simply do not work in a COVID environment. And they need also to be, the reason why I came up with COVID plus is what we might call the traditional disruptions, flood, fires, cyber emergencies, a recent earthquake in Melbourne. Heaven only knows what we might manage to come up with in Australia. Those things haven't gone away, the floods, fires, cyber attacks, the earthquake, but they're within an environment of COVID. And so therefore you need to be preparing through exercising and reviewing your plans in a way that deals with those challenges of COVID, which may restrict your choices in dealing with the traditional disruptions, which you might get simultaneously.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now, the appreciation of resilience, has it risen in your organisation as a result of the pandemic? Almost universally, we can see, yes, it has. So 4 out of 5 organisations have said the appreciation has risen, very much so, or somewhat so. And again, there's some really good quotes on page 32 of the report, which you can look at and get some learnings about what people have been doing. I think it would be an error to ignore that 1 in 20, so no, not at all, no, not really, where appreciation hasn't risen. Now, when I spoke to people who said that in their survey answers, a lot of them are in public sector, healthcare, or further education environments where reporting lines are much more complex. You know, in further education, for example, they might have somebody at board level who is a senior academic who doesn't get resilience and may actually think they can do resilience much better than the business continuity department or the resilience department, depending how it is aligned within the organisation. Very, very difficult to get heard. It can be due to funding as well. Obviously, within commercial organisations, they really do have to look at their bottom lines. Very, very worried about, you know, shareholder value, for example. In other organisations where funding comes from a different place, they just might not get the importance of resilience, and they really do need to, of course. Now, part of this, you know, appreciation, we often talk about how the board aren't engaged. There's a lot of frustration there, but part of that actually needs to come from the other way round. You know, it is the job of that resilience manager, that business continuity manager, to really promote upwards the importance of resilience and business continuity to senior management. Now, I've put this on to scare everybody. Don't worry, I don't expect you to be able to read that. I certainly can't. But we asked this question last year as well. So we asked respondents what they perceived as the most important attributes of a business continuity manager. You can see there's a massive long list. When you are able to download the report, if you haven't already, this is on page 34 of the report. So you'll be able to download this and look at that in a lot more detail. But I've just displayed this to show how many attributes there were. But I've distilled the top 5 rated traits and the bottom 5 rated traits so you can see these in a bit more detail. Now this goes along the same lines as we found last year. So those higher rated trends, you know, collaborative working, facilitating, problem solver, inspiring others to solve problems, they are these new facets that business continuity and resilience managers really need to develop in their skill set in order to get that buy-in that they need from above. Planning, you'll see that's in 4th place. It's only just in 4th place, so a very, very small amount down. That was in top position last year, and it's just gone slightly backwards. I don't think we can draw too much on that because of the small percentage difference, but what we are seeing, and I think it's worth pointing out, we're seeing people evolve their planning processes, newer ways of planning, going away from that all threats and all hazards approach and much more onto just planning for the effect rather than the cause. This means plans can be created for what to do if all staff have to work from home rather than what happens when a pandemic hits, trying to consider every single point in that rather than the intricacies that can happen that can be applied to multiple events. A lot of interviewees as well, they talked about having a salesperson. You know, there was a quote in a report, you can't get a seat at the table if you don't fight for it. A lot of people have really, really fought for that position at that level in the organisation. Loads of quotes here, page 35 to 36 of the report, about just that, about how business continuity professionals have really banged on the door of the board, of executive team meetings to ensure that their voice is heard. It should be mentioned here that some really do struggle to get that buy-in, particularly in certain cultures, within certain geographies, to be able to do that. It would not be seen as, you know, a good career move to really battle that position. So a lot are still struggling with that. And again, it's organisations as well that had business continuity as a tick box exercise. So we're seeing there, we are still seeing these traits as important. So a lot of professionals within who do have this problem, they're first looking to establish things like free flowing information in order to sort of set the foundations to getting resilience much better appreciated within their organisations. Lowest rating traits here are those which demand sort of controlling type behaviours, which don't necessarily work. In some scenarios, you do still need that command and control in order to be able to get an effective and quick response. But it's no longer the case for the majority. And, you know, if there's too much command and control, it can lead to a lack of trust, fear amongst staff. I suggest you look up, Google the L'Aquila earthquake in Italy. That's a really good example of a failure in this particular area. There was a massive earthquake, destroyed a lot of the town. The army was sent in, totally ignored people on the ground who knew exactly what to do, you know, where all the passages were underground, where all the electricity supplies were. And it forced people out of the town. They ended up moving into camps, which were referred to as prison camps, outside a village, loads of fear. And ultimately that town's now a ghost town. No one's returned due to this fear. High level of academic qualifications, well, that's low, 34.3%. In some specialised jobs, that's obviously required. In, you know, IT, for example, academic qualifications are still very much sought. But that's on the lower list of priorities. Professional qualifications, they feature much higher up the list. Chris, again, you made quite an amusing remark here about you having to apologise in the early stages of your career for not being an IT person. So can you just share that?
Yes, indeed. When I first came into business continuity, it was very much weighted in terms of DR, disaster recovery in the IT space. And having a background in HR, work health and safety, corporate strategic and business planning seemed like, you know, they were too soft a skills. Why on earth would you want to be a business continuity manager? With that background, you need an IT background. However, now in a pandemic, all of a sudden, those sort of skills, as is indicated by these findings, are the ones that people are searching for and realising that they need to be looking for that skills profile in their business continuity managers, or developing those skills with various training opportunities. So I'm not surprised that the soft skills have really come to the fore in these results.
Thank you very much, Chris. So we've talked about getting that buy-in from above, and in a lot of organisations, it's already getting direct results, both from a financial and a resource perspective. So this raised appreciation is working, and it really is working. We are seeing jobs created. If you look at LinkedIn, for example, there's an awful lot of jobs there now which have resilience in their job title, new positions being created, and also getting more people within teams as well. There's a great quote in the report, which I'm going to read out. Business continuity now matters more to more people, either because they have seen it work or because they have seen it not work. Good quote, that. And I think, you know, that does sum it up. What we've also seen is sort of specialised funding as well coming in, you know, in particular areas. In IT, for example, we're seeing a lot of investment now come in for things like IT infrastructure, cybersecurity, and also applications as well. So there's a lot more funding coming in. I think it might not quite be with the rose-tinted spectacles view that we've got on this slide. I think if we were to turn this question on its head, ask financial managers, CFOs, what they thought about additional funding, we might get a slightly different answer. But generally, and certainly the what I've got from research around these figures, there are real examples of getting more support, getting more funding. Really, really positive to see. Collaboration, big point here. We've talked about a lot about, you know, support from above, but it's a collaboration point as well that is absolutely crucial to really having a resilient organisation. We talk about this a lot in reports. So I've just got a single slide on this point, which says it all. So we asked, how do you believe organisational collaboration will change for the positive post-pandemic? Now you can see that one at the top, nearly 3/4. There will be greater collaboration between business continuity and other areas such as IT, HR and facilities. You know, people are very much hopeful of those bridges that they've built during the pandemic will continue post-pandemic. I think what's interesting to note here as well, we asked the same question last year, and universally all the points are slightly less percentages for each of those points this year. I think that's because we've already made a step forward. A lot of organisations are already doing this, so we're starting from a higher base than we were last year. Research definitely backs this up. We've seen that organisations are being much more collaborative. Interviewees spoke of this. There's some really good quotes again in the report about what professionals have seen happening with their own organisations, the measures they've implemented to really ensure that that will continue going forward. We talk a lot about siloing practices. Again, 40.7% believe that those siloing practices will be reduced, and also greater communication between sector peers as well. 38%, quite a high percentage. Previously, I think a lot of organisations do not want to talk to their sectors. There's worries about competitive intelligence, but we are seeing those community groups created now for the good of the industry. Working groups as well, which have been established. They were only being talked about last year within sectors, within local peer organisations. They have now been created, firmly established, and they're now working together for the good of the industry. If you haven't downloaded it already, there was a crisis management report published around a month ago by the BCI, and that talks a lot about this sort of breaking down of silos, collaborative working. So if you want to know a bit more about this subject, I suggest you download that report. Now we get on to planning and process. Again, this might not necessarily have the most inspiring title, but I think from a personal perspective, planning and process has actually got a hell of a lot more interesting during the pandemic. And we're seeing some really interesting, innovative ways that practitioners are now going about their day-to-day business. I also wanted to mention there's quite a big section about regulation in the report, which I haven't covered in this presentation due to time, but that discusses the issue about regulation in the industry, and it's worth having a look at if that's something you're interested in. Generally, the industry does actually want regulation, but there's obviously caveats around that, such as forcing BC to then become sort of retrograde and become a tick box exercise. But there's some good discussion points in there that are outlined in the report. Anyway, so how do BC professionals believe the planning process should change? Now, the pandemic's really formed as a catalyst to change the planning processes. There's a lot of talk in the report, and it's what we've mentioned before. It's planning for the effect of a hazard, of an incident, rather than the cause. So a lot of organisations have really moved to that way of planning during the pandemic. We did have some comments that there were certain scenarios that were beyond the remit of business continuity. Quite surprising there. I struggle to think of those that would be beyond the remit. I think they're probably those which would typically involve blue light scenarios, emergency scenarios. But if we look at the responses to this question, I've seen three key themes emerging. So more collaboration in planning processes with department leads and the board. So that's the left and the right response on this slide. So having the board more involved, and we've talked about this a lot already, it can lead to less conflicts arising. For example, if a critical process has to be stopped and the board do not perceive they've agreed to it. There's also the side benefit as well of making them more aware of resilience and business continuity. Having department leads involved can help to gain expert input as well from other departments. It leads to transparency of information, enhanced information flows, and the building of trust. It can also lead to a wider voice for promotion of resilience to management. Making plans more accessible, not just making them accessible, not just posting them on the company intranet, is promoting the existence of those plans. And what we've seen is a lot of organisations have now created business continuity and resilience documentation for the purposes of staff or management within that organisation. They're short, jargon-free, quick to read pieces of information that really resonate with terminology that staff on the ground really understand, and those type of documents are being promoted. And there's also the point here about agility. So making sure plans can be altered, they're agile in an elongated incident such as COVID-19. Again, the crisis management report showed just how organisations, those that elicited the most successful responses were those who adapted plans according to the stage of the crisis that we're in. Others ensured that BC cover was available even if business priorities change, and it's still and wasn't included in the BIA. During an elongated crisis such as a pandemic, priorities will wax and wane and often change entirely, and it's important that the plans, the processes behind those adapt accordingly. This also comes into the post-incident review as well, and there's changes being made in that, which I'm going to cover on the next slide actually. Really good quotes here on page 48 onwards. I've said 48 onwards because there's a lot of quotes which you can use as little case studies within your own organisations and really make learnings from how other people are looking at the planning process within their own organisation. So I've put here the rise of the interim review. I'll get to that in a minute. So how does a post-incident review process work in your organisation? Now, these are the top 3 responses. Bit of a concern here, only 48.9, so under half have a post-incident review process that's led by the exec. That means the exec either don't have an interest at all, or they can't make learnings from the crisis which can really input into the resilience of that organisation. If you look at the right-hand side, again, bit of a concern, organisations, so 29.5%, you know, they've got to they've devolved those review responsibilities. Different parts of the organisation have their own processes, typically not centralised as well. Some will have some kind of centralisation involved, but ultimately are carried out on a local level. I'll raise those issues again. This can lead to lack of trust, duplication of work, differing levels of information to management, lack of information transparency, and poor workflows. Ultimately, a cost sink. We certainly don't want to be promoting that within our organisations. First, I'm going to just bring on Terry. I know you just wanted to say a couple of sentences about this subject area, and then I'll bring on Chris. I know it's her favourite subject, so I'll try and keep it quick, but Chris can talk forever about this. So Terry first, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few points.
Thank you, Rachel. And Chris and I agree on quite a lot of things. I just wanted to point out that during COVID, when it first started, I did advise all my leaders to make notes of the lessons learned as it was going along, because I did realise that COVID was going to last for a long time. And we did teach all our crisis managers and incident managers to do the same thing, and the business continuity champions, because when something's going on and it's for a long period of time, our memories are not as necessarily as sharp as they are, because we're dealing with the now. So if you learn something, or something doesn't happen as right, or something changes, do it now. Make sure it's documented. And then my previous employer had me create lessons learned 6 months into the pandemic, and I interviewed every single. We were in 27 countries, so I interviewed every single board, every single function. I did the silver team, I did the gold team, and then produced that. And we were only 6 months into what was going on, and that carried on beyond that. And I think part of the thing is that let's face it, when the pandemic happened, and before the pandemic, as a business continuity professional, if you went to the board and said, "I want to do an exercise about a global pandemic," you never got any airtime. It'll never happen. It was too big for them. I think that's changed now, and that people are more listening to the fact that if there's an elongated crisis or a major incident, because it's not a crisis anymore, a major incident, that we need to start documenting and collecting that information as time goes.
Thank you, Terry. And on to Chris.
Yeah, yes, indeed, Rachel. As you recall, I presented a workshop at the BCI Horizons conference about interim post-incident reviews, but I noticed that Castellian calls them mid-action reviews. But whichever, we're going about the same, talking about the same thing, because we want to capture, as the British and Australian Army would call it, the oil methodology: observations, insights, lessons identified, and lessons learned. And remembering that lessons are only learned when you make changes. So feeding those lessons while they're captured earlier in the process into strengthening your plans and the resiliency of your business and organisation.
Yeah, so that interim review is really becoming a crucial part of structure, and not waiting until the end before changes are made, because it'll probably be too late. So next section, we're getting towards the end now. Did I just skip a slide? I think no, maybe I didn't. Sorry. So we're going to look at remote working as an option going forward. This is a very wordy question. I'll just distill the main points on this slide. So just going down, 8.5% of organisations, when they were asked how they were going to consider workplace resilience and home working going forward, 8.2% of organisations, they're in a physical environment, so they have no option to use home working as an option. 9.2% made the temporary move to home working, but they will be going back to the office as it's easier for them to manage risks within that environment. Over a third, 36.2%, it will now be part of the BC response. Home working will be. 20.9% remote working will be part of the BC response, but improvements do need to be made. 7.1% will use work from home exclusively as a business continuity response. There's no operational risk to doing that. There's still a reluctance from senior management, so 7.8% there saying that senior management are reluctant to incorporate this. So this basically shows that home working will either be used as a permanent or hybrid solution, but the majority of organisations will still use it as a full or partial solution to loss of workplace. It's all still panning out, and there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to bring Andrew in now just to have a few words about this area, because he is our in-house expert.
Well, thanks, Rachel. I think when we went home last March with laptops under our arms, and if you're lucky, an office chair, we all thought that, of course, this was just for a month or two, and we'd be back in the office by September, and that, of course, that extended to 6 months and 12 months and now 18 months. And over that time, of course, it's clear that hybrid working is a way that we're going to work going forward. And actually, it's an entirely valid way of an entirely valid fallback position from an office. In fact, many organisations we're talking to are using their office as fallback for their home workers. So it's actually flipped on its head. I mean, it's an important and valid way of looking at things. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're finding that people are replacing their work area recovery with work from home in many instances.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And moving on into work area recovery itself. Now, we asked people what their opinions were about the future of work area recovery. What was very interesting this year, we got a lot of negative responses last year. There were many users of work area recovery who were pretty dismayed when their providers couldn't allow for split team working because their main office was still working. So that created a lot of negativity and blame towards that work area recovery providers. The reality is, if they had let everyone, all their customers, do that, there wouldn't have been any space in these work area recovery buildings. others as well, they were absolutely convinced they would move permanently to a work from home environment as their only recovery solution. And I think what this presentation has shown, there's a lot more to working from home than just sending your staff home with a laptop. So organisations are now beginning to realise the implications of sending staff from home. But the figures are positive this year. So only 5% plan not to renew at all, and a further 4.3% will be exploring other ways. Now, if we look at this in the context of those who did have a work area recovery provider, if we take that top option off, that 35.6% who haven't used one, 14.4% of those who had a provider will not be renewing. That's fairly low given the anger we saw last year and real dismay that organisations weren't going to use a provider. So much more positivity there, and I think that's a much fairer amount as well. 25.2% of those who did have a provider will be planning to use it as before. So a quarter will be using it in exactly the same way. 24.5%, so another quarter, they'll be scaling back their contract, but will still be using it. And then you can see, again, split team working can be enabled, 16.8% there. So 60.8% will be using it if split team working is announced. Andrew, expert again on this work area recovery area, can you just elaborate a bit more around this, if that's okay?
Sure. Interesting stats actually, because we're seeing maybe something different, or at least a different way of looking at work area recovery in our customer base, and certainly in the UK. I think shared work area recovery is falling out of favour because those that we're going to take the time to move their staff to a shared work area recovery facility generally had a lower criticality, time criticality, and now feel that home working is sufficient. Where shared work area recovery is being retained, the numbers are being decreased so that the fallback facility is sufficient for a crisis management team or as a hub for recovery operations. But what we are seeing is that dedicated work area recovery, particularly dedicated trading floor, is still a requirement. And if anything, it's actually increased slightly in demand over last year and pre-pandemic, as organisations want to take more control over their resilience of their critical operations. Now, I think as service providers, we've gone through the denial phase where work area recovery is absolutely fine and nothing's going to change, to now we're embracing the sort of new reality, if you like. We will have to be more flexible and innovative to keep pace with change, and I think that change will continue to happen over the coming couple of years as we settle into the new way of working. But I know that recovery service providers in the UK and worldwide are being more flexible, having more flexible contracts, providing access outside of disasters, and including in business as usual situations. Now, as you know, we've actually focused on the home work and resilience side of things, and trying to ensure that this is simply and effectively achieved for global enterprise workforces.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Now, if we go on again, it very much links into what Andrew was just saying there about what services are you now looking for in a work area recovery provider. So this is a percentage of respondents believing an option is essential. So what we can see here is those criteria which were pretty desirable this time last year have actually shot way down the list. They're not included in this because this is the top 5. So a shared recovery space, that's only desired now by 8.2%, shorter contracts as well, 7.1%, so a real change. So I think the points to note here, that 46.3%, organisations want specialist backup now for specific situations. If a cyber incident happens, if people are working from home, there's a cyber incident that affects their whole network, they'll want to get staff up and running again, so they need that system and infrastructure backup. Again, this has become more of an incident during COVID. A real heightened number of attacks have been happening, denial of service attacks, for example. So I think that's why that's popped up. And it's actually quite encouraging to see organisations are now looking beyond COVID. Resilience for home workers, so nearly a third now expects some degree of resilience for home workers. And I think the concept of work area recovery provider is becoming just that. It's a working area recovery. It's not just people in an office. It's protecting the whole work stream of staff. So interviewees said that in many situations during COVID, home working staff had no access to services at home if there was a power outage, for example, and they automatically assumed that they could bring staff back into the office if that did happen. Obviously, if the office is closed, they can't do that if there's no transportation available. So those considerations really need to be made. Buying additional products and services specifically for home workers will enable them to be able to continue. More flexibility in plans as well. This caused considerable anger last year, but it's now actually a sort of a desirable attribute. 22.5% do want more flexibility. So, for example, that ability to use for split team working. Now, there's a real onus here on work area recovery providers to really change their services accordingly. So, Andrew, I'm conscious of time. We have a few questions. So do you mind just inputting here fairly quickly on your own thoughts about this?
Hi there, sorry, pressing the right buttons. Following on from what I was saying before, we will need to be more flexible and listen to the market and understand where we can deliver value. I think work area recovery providers have assets and large office spaces. We just need to make sure that the way that they're delivered within services is relevant to the new way of working. I mean, there's not too much more to say on that, really. I suppose the one we pick out, of course, is the resilience for home workers. If you're looking at the way work area recovery used to work, which is, or in fact still does, the work area recovery centre is going to be half an hour to an hour maximum away from the office. When somebody has a problem at home and you're expecting them to get back into the office or get to the recovery centre, that often, many commutes, at least in the UK, are over an hour. And by the time they've sort of packed up and got themselves across to the office, their home incident, very much like your 20-second outage, has maybe passed. So if you're building resilience into the home for those critical workers, you're going to be dealing with 90% of the potential incidents that home worker is going to be encountering.
Yeah, no, very relevant comments there. Thank you very much, Andrew. Now we're getting to the end. So considering some of the events that have happened in the past year related to extreme weather, as well as areas plagued by regular power outages, how are you ensuring your organisations are resilient? So are all these home workers who work in a remote environment resilient? The answer given this question is a very resounding no. So over 2/3 report that their offices have power backup, but nearly half, there you can see that second point, have no plans in place for home workers so they can continue to function in case of an incident. Interviewees spoke how they plan to bring staff back into the office if there was a state power cut, for example, but the answer when it was to put them, what would happen if the office was closed? They weren't able to answer that, which was interesting. A third of home workers, provide home workers with plans in case of an energy outage, so only a third. And again, a third is sort of a pledge to ensure that workers have power and communications resilience to cope with outages. Will this include power outages? Many just consider communications. Now, some interviewees talked about having power generators available to some staff. I know Terry talked about this earlier in the India environment, who performed critical activities within the home environment. But how many had done so? An interesting point, Chris, just briefly, I know you wanted to just quickly talk about emergency backup.
Yes, indeed, Rachel, and it's even more than that. It's looking at internet speed, the loss of power. We lost power for 36 hours. The way in which the Australian National Broadband Network was designed was for faster internet speeds and wider, larger pipes in our CBDs, not in our suburbs where people are requiring it now. So even just trying to maintain business as usual in remote work when you've got less than optimal internet speed, unreliable power supplies, or sometimes intermittent, especially during our storm season in Australia, all of these things are going to impact on your capacity to deliver. And of course, that made Andrew's Res Cube very instantly appealing. The moment I was introduced to it, I thought, oh, now there's an opportunity there to deliver those kind of capacities which previously we've had in our larger offices, data centres and the like, which are very difficult to replicate in the home environment. But Andrew seems to have come up with a solution.
Yeah, good old Andrew. He's not just inputting good words of nuggets, he's actually delivering products. So how long have we got before the learnings of COVID shape the industry before it becomes yesterday's news? I'll just go over this very briefly. People think they've got longer than they did last year. I think there was a panic last year. We had this sudden spotlight and it was all going to fade within a month or so. That hasn't happened. It's still ongoing. And almost the blessing of this long tail of COVID has kept that interest alive. So, you know, you can see here that, most people think we've got a year to make changes. Only 6.1% say it's already too late. And I think what we've seen this year is organisations have made such a lot of changes already. They've been really innovative about this, and those changes are already happening. So they're not becoming yesterday's news. They're now becoming real implemented practice within organisations. Just going to finish with a slide. Do you think it would be timely for the BCI to champion a resilience good practice guidelines targeted at the executive? I'm not going to go through the responses here. I want to just bring Chris in because I think it's best that Chris talks about this rather than me. I work at the BCI, so I know Chris is a great supporter of this. So Chris, do you just mind just having a very quick couple of words? And I'm conscious of the time.
Well, I was an instant fan of this idea because I've been a great fan of the GPG Light Guide. I've sent that to many executives to encourage them to wrap their head around business continuity. And I think if we were to develop a similar guide, about 20 pages at the absolute outside, 30 with an excellent exec sum, I think we'd have a bestseller in the minds of many executives. We'd get that into their hands and heads. So worth trying.
Thank you, Chris. I think, it's got to be thought about in a lot more detail than 30 pages might seem. So I think we've really got to ensure that it's not just the BCI producing this, it's input from other areas other areas of the resilience community, and very much targeted at the executive. It would be very hard to create an operational good practice guidelines for resilience, but I think one targeted at the exec would be preferential. So quick key learnings. Role of the BC manager is now multifaceted. It's not just that operational role, it's really branching into the new strategic direction. And as you can see with those traits we discussed earlier, that is now happening. Remote working becoming the norm for most organisations. Discussed that in a lot of detail. More work needs to be done on resilience regarding that. Phil Carter actually has just made a comment, work area recovery providers, will they focus more on security to accommodate more home worker recovery? We'll get onto that in the questions, but that obviously is something which will need to be looked at by work area recovery providers. Chief Resilience Officer, no longer a rarity. We're getting those closer reporting lines to the board. We're getting roles created at board level. Planning processes are becoming more inclusive, adaptable and agile. So really adapting to that changing situation, a plan for an elongated crisis with the best will in the world isn't going to be as effective as one which can adapt, within a framework to where the scenario is at the moment. So we are going to go on to questions now. So if the panelists wouldn't mind turning their cameras on, I'm just going to go through this. I've seen a few questions come in. I think an interesting one I'm going to come to first is one from Phil Carter, again, who's actually said, a lot of organisations believe that home workers reduce their risk of a single incident affecting all workers, and we're therefore more resilient. So if that, as I understand that, that's one person working. If they go down, it's not so much of an issue as the whole office goes down. On the face of it, you're right. What I would say to that question is, what if that person is performing an absolutely critical activity within their home environment? I used my example earlier of, the power going down when I was doing that presentation. It could be something far, far more critical than me waffling on in a presentation. So I think it's really considering, those critical activities that are being performed in a home environment. It might only be one person, but it could bring down the whole organisation. Has anyone on the panel got anything they'd like to add? I saw Andrew nodding away there. So Andrew, do you want to just quickly input on that one?
Yeah, I'd agree completely. And the idea behind rescue, thanks for the kind comments, is that it's really not for everybody. It's for 5 to 10% of the workforce that are highly critical. Actually, it's probably the same people that were going to be going to a work area recovery centre are now needing that level of resilience. So it's not for everybody, and I think it's pretty worth noting that.
Thank you. Do Terry or Chris, would you like to input on that particular point? Terry?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I think that I like Andrew's device. I'd love an opportunity to evaluate one. I think what's going to happen is that as we do our BIA process, we're going to be identifying more the key workers, and also I think it requires planning to make remote workers more resilient. We have to have geographical separation of them, because if they're all coming from the centre of London, then if the centre of London goes down, if they live in the centre of London, we lose them anyway. And we also have to make sure that we have diversity of suppliers of things like broadband and power, not on the same grid. All the things that we would do if we were putting 2 data centres in locations. So yeah, I agree with everything. But I think it should be part of our business norm planning through the BIA process.
Yeah, no, I think that's that. Chris?
Just quickly, Rachel, the cyber attack is still a real issue, and some of my clients have been smart enough to roll out the software that they use on premises to the working remotely colleagues to amp up their security. Cyber security capabilities, because you've got the kids doing homeschooling on the same laptop. There's an awful lot of BYO device going on out there. So there's huge vulnerabilities to cyber attack. And I don't think that that's been adequately addressed by everyone that I've sort of tumbled across in this process.
Yeah. I mean, I think this probably brings us, we're talking about cyber a lot here. And I think that's a question I just saw when I was doing that, greatest hit slides at the end. So Phil Carter's asked, will work area recovery providers need to focus more on security as the model changes to accommodate home worker recovery? Andrew, do you want to make a comment on that question?
Yeah, certainly can do. And Fortress is still alive and kicking and delivering work area recovery services, and actually the other half of the business is cybersecurity. So endpoint security and network security and all those the sort of areas of security, and they are closely linked. If you look at the security and resilience of infrastructure, I think they should be closely linked. As far as work area recovery, what we found was that the enterprises wanted to take control and keep control of their own security, and so what we were doing was providing them with sort of blank canvas of infrastructure, and it was the security teams that would overlay whatever security controls that they wanted to apply. So even though we had one side of the business which focuses on security, it was that they didn't actually interact quite as much as you would anticipate. Maybe that will change.
Yeah. Actually, Phil's just added he was thinking more about multiple customers in the same physical footprint.
Oh, that's certainly, sorry, I don't want to sort of say too much here, but basically that's basically part of the delivery of the infrastructure. So, for example, if you had two work area recovery suites, they would be on completely separate networks, physically separate networks rather than logical networks. And so that ensures that there is this separation. And at the end of an invocation, obviously that recovery suite is then completely wiped down, including all the PCs and the rest of the infrastructure. So yes, I mean, that's built into the processes.
Yeah. Chris, you're nodding a lot there. Do you have something to add?
Yes, I've been very interested in some of these alternative working arrangements, and especially since some people have found it very difficult to work from home and for security reasons couldn't go into their workplace due to COVID restrictions and the like. So this whole notion of how you sort of knit together these hybrid arrangements where you'll have some people working remotely at home, some people working remotely perhaps at alternate office locations, and some people possibly working at your principal location, and how you bring all that together and continue your business in an orderly and cyber secure and other secure, physical secure ways. I think we're just really beginning to tease out those challenges.
Thank you, Chris. I know I'm conscious we've overrun a bit with time. A lot of you are still on. So I'd like to finish with a question for everyone. That's coming from Sharon Buckland, who's actually made an awful lot of comments in the questions. I don't know if everyone can read those, but they're really good comments that Sharon's been making throughout the presentation. We'll capture those because we do get sent them automatically afterwards. But Sharon's asked, in order to engage the board, does the panel feel a preparedness measure would be the clincher to gain attention and make the board or the leaders realise just how vulnerable or prepared their people are for disruption? So who would like to answer that question first? No one. As I understand it, Sharon, maybe you could just clarify that a bit. So an autogageable, does the panel feel a preparedness measure would be the clincher to gain attention? So what kind of preparedness measure would we need in an organisation to gain attention? So I think that's sort of talking about, you know, probably benchmarking where organisations are in the process, and you know they're not meeting that standard. As far as I can read it, you know, and we need a standard. You know, resilience good practice guidelines is a way to go. And yes.
Yeah, I think perhaps what Sharon is when she says preparedness measures is things like exercising and training and rehearsing. And okay. The thing has been in the past that as part of the report has shown is that actually engagement with senior people, they've always said it's been difficult. They've always sent their deputies along, and the only one that I've seen really goes traction is when you do a gold exercise, because the CEO's involved and therefore everybody wants to be seen. I had the same. I was working in Tokyo, and I had the same thing. Well, I had the Asia Pacific managing director involved. I had every single leader. The moment that he had to be called away to go to somewhere in Singapore, and that team of 40 people dropped down to 3, because it was just basically they turned up because of him. I think that it's more about actually having active communications and turning our talk about not exercising and planning, but what the risks are to the business, going more strategic, more of a strategic BIA approach. I know that the BCI Good Practice Guide has changed the terminology from strategic to I think it's products and services BIA. I think that was a mistake personally. I think we need to be strategic. We need to actually engage with the C-level in the languages that the language that they speak. We need to talk about business, the first word of what we're trying to do, business continuity or resilience. So to answer Sharon's question, I think it's not about exercising, training and planning, because you won't get them to get engaged in that, but actually talking their language so they understand the threats in their language. And then the engagement at the C-level, more of the awareness side of activities. That's my point of view anyway.
Chris, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? I know you're sort of barking up the same tree as Terry on this point, but.
Absolutely, but it's using, for instance, your interim post-incident reviews or your mid-action reviews, if you prefer that, feeding those upwards, but feeding them up in a sort of summary way, which is pitched at what the C-suite want to understand, which is how vulnerable is my business? What vulnerabilities be identified that I need to invest in, papering over those cracks, because there will be further waves and there will be further outbreaks. No matter what we do, no matter how much vaccine we get out there, there will still be more sort of bumps in the road, if I can use that phrase. So you want to feed that up there and focus on vulnerabilities, but not just the vulnerabilities. What are the solutions? Because I've learnt something about the bosses over and over again in my career. They don't want to hear about the problems. They want to hear about the problems and the solutions, or at least the options that they might consider.
And Andrew, do you have some comments quickly you'd like to make on this point as well?
No, I think it's all been said actually, and I do completely agree with the solutions coming along with the problems. If you give somebody, here's a problem, here are some solutions, that's absolutely what people want to see. That busy people, and actually, the more you can do that, the more that they will engage with you, because obviously you're going to be somebody who's going to help solve problems. So, yeah, I completely agree with all those points.
Thank you for that. Sharon's actually added a couple more points. We haven't got time to discuss it. But she said, what if we didn't start with a BIA that did many scenarios to understand how prepared staff are? Although we gain through this we gain an understanding off the bat how prepared staff are. We then tailor our programme around the results from these scenarios. We could then focus on the weaker areas first and provide the board with a dashboard of preparedness for the organisation. So it is looking at that sort of dashboard and sort of criteria, how you measure yourselves against it. I'd love to discuss that more. I don't think we've got time. We've already overrun a bit. And Chris, go on then, 2 sentences.
Oh, goodness. Well, I guess it's all about keeping on, but managing upwards, because you need those champions. They're the ones with the budget. They're the ones with the purse strings. You need to be seen as an influencer and a value adding to their business and dealing with their pain points, back to that vulnerability, identifying them and giving them solutions, or at least options, which they might consider that would be in that solution basket.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. So we have to bring that to an end. I apologise for going on a few minutes longer than we planned, but we've had some interesting questions coming in, and it's been really valuable to get the insight of all 3 of you as well throughout the presentation. I would encourage you again to go to the BCI website and download the report. But in the meantime, it just leaves me to thank Andrew, Terry and Chris very, very much for giving their time today and inputting onto this very, very valuable subject for the industry. And again, I'd like to thank ResCube as well for their support on this. And I think it's really come to the fore how useful a product like that is for organisations. So thank you very much to the 3 of you, and also thank you very much to everyone who's dialed in today and sort of stayed active and asked some really thought-provoking topics in that Q&A at the end. So thank you very much. Download the report.
Thank you to you, Rachel, for your great presentation and report.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I don't need thanks. It's the team as well that have put this together, so thank you. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the next launch. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.